Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. I am so glad you found your way here tonight, because what I have in store for you is not just a collection of stories. It is a journey into some of the most unsettling, most emotionally raw, and most genuinely unexplained moments that real people have experienced within the cold, sterile walls of hospitals. Places that are supposed to represent healing, hope, and the miracle of modern medicine. And yet, over and over again, the people who spend the most time inside those walls, the nurses, the doctors, the patients, the worried families sitting in hard plastic chairs at 3 in the morning, they all seem to carry the same haunted look when they speak about what they have seen, what they have heard, what they cannot explain. So go ahead and settle in right now. Pull your blanket a little closer, turn down the lights if you dare, because tonight we are going inside the haunted hospital. We are walking those long, echoing corridors where the fluorescent lights flicker for no reason. We are stepping past the doors that open on their own. We are sitting with the nurses who heard their names whispered from an empty hallway, and the doctors who delivered a baby that did not survive, only to hear crying coming from an operating theater that was completely empty. These are not campfire tales invented for the sake of a thrill. These are real accounts shared by real people, people with careers and responsibilities and absolutely no desire to believe in something they cannot logically explain. And yet they do believe, because they had no choice. If you are joining us here for the very first time, welcome to the family. Please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single story. We gather here regularly, and trust me, you will not want to be left out when the next one arrives. Now, let the darkness take control. Our first story comes from someone who served in the Navy, stationed at Fort Belvoir's old Army base hospital. And if you have never had the misfortune of spending time in a building like this one, let me help you picture it. This was a sprawling, 5-story structure, a genuine relic left over from the Second World War, the kind of building that carries weight in its very walls. Its bones were old. Its paint was peeling in places no one bothered to repaint anymore. Of the 5 floors it contained, only the first and second remained active and in daily use for patient care. The upper levels, floors 3, 4, and 5, had been sealed off entirely. No patient rooms up there anymore. No busy nursing stations, no beeping monitors, no hurried footsteps of medical staff racing against the clock. Just storage. Row upon row of extra chairs stacked awkwardly on top of one another, discarded gurneys gathering cobwebs in the corners, obsolete medical carts that nobody had bothered to haul away, every surface thick with the slow, undisturbed accumulation of years and years of dust. You get the picture. A sealed world unto itself. Quiet, still, forgotten. On one particular afternoon, our narrator and his sailor buddy decided they needed an extra chair. A simple, practical errand. The kind of thing that seems completely reasonable until, in hindsight, you wish you had just made do without the chair. The two of them climbed past the authorized personnel-only signs that had been taped crookedly across the fire doors, those slightly lopsided warnings that everyone always tells themselves don't really apply to them, and made their way up into one of those deserted upper floors. The former birthing ward, the nursery level, the place where, in another era, the sounds of new life and tiny first cries would have filled these very same corridors. Now they were silent, completely, heavily silent in the way that only truly abandoned places ever are. The two men strolled down the dim corridor, their footsteps soft, and their voices kept low without either of them quite knowing why, when a particular doorway stopped them cold. They did not plan to stop. Something about that room simply reached out and pulled their attention in whether they wanted it or not. Through the open doorway, the walls were washed in a faded pastel color, soft and worn, the kind of cheerful shade that had once been chosen deliberately to comfort and soothe, now drained of its warmth by time and neglect. And there, positioned precisely in the center of the room as though it had been placed there with great intention, sat an old wooden rocking chair. Both men froze mid-step, the way your body sometimes reacts before your mind has fully processed what your eyes have just seen. They exchanged a quick, wide-eyed glance, and our narrator broke the silence in a hushed voice. "Did you see that?" His buddy nodded slowly, the kind of careful, deliberate nod that means yes, I absolutely saw it, and I'm not entirely sure I want to talk about what we both just saw. Because what they had both caught in that split second before reason could catch up was a silhouette. A vague, indistinct shape sitting in that rocking chair, swaying it with a slow, gentle rhythm. A figure hunched slightly forward, arms curved close to the chest, in the unmistakable posture of someone cradling something precious and small against their body. Curiosity, as it so often does, overruled every sensible instinct they had. They went back, they stepped closer, they looked again. Chair was completely still, not swaying even a fraction of an inch. Empty in the way only truly unoccupied furniture is, not a single creak, not a single groan of old wood springs settling. No retreating footsteps, no soft shuffle fading away down the hall. The entire floor was deserted. Staff avoided it almost entirely, visiting only on rare occasions when a supply run absolutely demanded it, and even then they came quickly and left quickly. There was no one. There had been no one. The two men stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, then did what sensible people do when confronted with something they cannot explain. They chalked it up to a trick of the light, to long shifts and tired eyes playing games. They shrugged it off, grabbed a chair from another room, and headed back downstairs. But the story does not end there. Several weeks later, the same two men found themselves back on that floor, this time hunting for cables. And as they passed that same doorway, the one with the faded pastel walls and the centered chair, something new caught our narrator's eye. A handwritten note had been taped carefully to the back slats of the rocking chair. Written in blocky, deliberate marker strokes, it said simply, "Please do not use or remove." That was strange enough to warrant a mention to his boss, whose expression shifted when the question was raised. The man looked up from whatever chart had been holding his attention, and his face carried a weight that said he had known this moment might come eventually. And then he told them. Mothers had used that chair. Mothers who had lost their babies, infants born still and silent into this world, had been brought to that room to use that rocking chair one final time, to hold their child close one last time. To rock that precious, weightless, bundled gently in their arms before surrendering them, before letting go and sending them down to the morgue. That chair had absorbed decades of the purest, most devastating grief a human being can experience. The two men stood there completely stunned, their minds reeling as the pieces assembled themselves. Had they glimpsed her, the spirit of one of those grieving mothers, her form blurred and softened by the passage of time, still rocking, still holding, still refusing to fully let go? Our narrator believes that moment confirmed something he had long suspected. That hospital carried the weight of its history in ways that went beyond bricks and mortar and old paint on walls. But what followed was far darker. Not long after their transfer to the brand new gleaming hospital built across the way, that sailor, his buddy, his partner through those long shifts and quiet corridors, took his own life. Our narrator is careful and honest here. He makes no claim that the rocking chair, the ghost, the grief-soaked room had anything to do with what happened. He does not draw that line. But the loss of someone you worked beside, laughed with, shared those silent glances of shared disbelief with, that kind of loss leaves marks on a person that go far deeper than words can ever reach. And he carries that weight still. Our next account comes from Spain. A woman's mother works as a radiologist at a public hospital in Catalonia, and what she experienced in December of 2019 has stayed with her, and with her daughter, ever since. This is a woman in good health, clear-minded, professional, with no history of any condition that might explain away unusual perceptions. The kind of person you trust when they tell you something strange happened, precisely because she does not say it lightly. She had just finished conducting a mammography in the imaging area. Her friend and patient had completed the procedure and was in the process of getting dressed again, the whole thing routine and unremarkable in the way that hundreds of such appointments were routine and unremarkable. Our narrator's mother stepped into the adjacent room, room 4, to pull up the images on the computer and begin reviewing them. She drew the heavy lead-lined door closed behind her as she always did, sealing out any stray ionizing radiation from drifting into the hallway beyond. Standard procedure, completely normal. No more than 30 seconds passed. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Not slowly, not tentatively, violently. As though someone on the other side had gripped it hard with both hands and was rattling the entire door frame with urgent, insistent force. She called out automatically, assuming it was her friend finished dressing and wanting to come in to ask about the results. "Come in," she said clearly. The knob kept rattling. She raised her voice, irritation creeping in at the apparent rudeness of whoever was standing just on the other side of that door, refusing to simply turn the handle and enter. "Come on in," she called again, louder this time. And then it hit her. Her friend could not possibly be out there. She had only just begun putting her clothes back on when the door had swung shut. There had been no time, none at all, for her to finish dressing, step out of the changing area, walk down the hallway, and arrive at room 4's door. It was physically impossible. A strange, cold certainty settled over her. She crossed to the door herself and opened it. The hallway was completely empty, not a soul in sight in either direction, just the long, quiet corridor and the soft hum of the building going about its business. This was not an isolated incident in room 4. Over time, other disturbances had gathered around that same space like a slow accumulation of evidence that something was simply wrong there. On one occasion, our narrator's mother sat in that same room with two fellow doctors, the three of them reviewing scans together, when one of her colleagues watched in stunned disbelief as a bottle of ultrasound gel launched itself from its resting place and flew at extreme speed straight into the nearest wall. With all three of them the only people present in the room, with no logical force having been applied to send it flying. A colleague who had worked that floor longer than most confided that she felt something profoundly wrong about that entire level. Not one room, not one corner, the whole floor. Whatever lingers there, it appears to be patient. Around the year 2004, a man brought his then-fiancée to the Del Coronado for an extended weekend getaway. This was a very old and storied hotel, one that had lived several lives before its current incarnation, having served for some years as a mental hospital after its earliest days as a grand and glamorous resort. Then it sat vacant for a stretch of years before renovations eventually reopened it. History layered upon history lives upon lives. Our narrator suffers from a severe allergy to cigarette smoke. He had reserved a non-smoking room well in advance. This was not a preference, it was a medical necessity. They arrived after the scheduled check-in time, expecting their room to be waiting. Instead, they were told the room was not yet ready and were invited to wait in the bar, where they were treated to complimentary cocktails while the staff sorted things out. About 45 minutes later, the concierge came to tell them their room was ready at last. The moment they stepped through the door, he knew. The smell hit him immediately, unmistakable and intrusive, the lingering scent of cigarette smoke soaked into the carpet and the curtains and the very air of the room. His allergic reaction began almost at once. He turned to his future wife and told her not to unpack a single thing because they would not be staying in this room. Back at the front desk, he explained the situation clearly. The manager on duty came out to speak with him personally and strangely seemed very reluctant to move them to a different room, offering instead to treat the space with air freshener and carpet cleaner, suggestions that demonstrated a certain misunderstanding of what a severe allergy actually means. Our narrator held firm. This was a medical issue. He needed a genuinely smoke-free room. Another 45 minutes passed while a new room was prepared. When they finally arrived at it, he was genuinely pleased. Beautiful view of the water, the beach stretching out beyond the window and not even the faintest trace of smoke in the air. A ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, controlled by a wall switch with settings for 3 speeds. Before they settled in for the night, he set it on the lowest speed. A gentle, slow rotation that was barely perceptible, comfortable, peaceful. He and his fiancée fell asleep. At 2 in the morning, he woke. Something was wrong. He could not immediately identify it, but the feeling was unmistakable, that particular alertness that pulls you out of sleep when the world around you has shifted in some way that your sleeping mind registered before your waking mind could. The air conditioning was running, but the room felt far colder than it should have, a cold that went beyond what any air conditioning unit ought to produce. And the ceiling fan, the one he had set to its lowest speed, was turning fast, not low-speed fast, high-speed fast. He lay there watching it, wondering if he had somehow knocked the switch in his sleep or if his fiancée had adjusted it. But she was still asleep beside him, completely undisturbed. And then the fan began to speed up even further. He watched it, his unease rising with each revolution, as it climbed past any normal speed and kept climbing still. It was spinning so fast that it seemed genuinely possible the blades might tear free of their mounting and go spiraling loose in the dark room. He got up. He went to the wall switch and turned it off. The fan kept spinning, faster still if anything. He stood there staring at it for a moment, a turned-off ceiling fan running at terrifying speed in a cold room in an old hotel that had once housed people who were not well. And then he did something very personal and very private. He went back to bed, and he prayed. Quietly internally, in opposition of whatever force was driving that fan to turn against all reason. As he prayed, the fan began to slow. Still switched off, still technically without power, but slowing, responding until eventually it simply stopped. He lay there in the silence and eventually drifted back to sleep. When morning came, the fan was still. Daylight filled the room and everything looked ordinary. He said nothing to his fiancée about what had happened during the night, choosing to let the memory sit quietly while he went about the business of getting ready for the day. He was in the bathroom shaving, a mundane, ordinary act, the kind of thing you do on autopilot, when a voice came clearly through the wall from the other side of the bathroom, not muffled or indistinct, clear. "Get me out of here." He later checked. There was no adjoining room on that side of the bathroom wall, nothing that could account for a voice reaching him through it, nothing there at all. He has always believed in the paranormal, and he has always been the kind of person who tries to apply logic first and look for rational explanations before accepting anything supernatural. But some experiences close that gap entirely between skepticism and belief. This was one of them. Now, if you're enjoying these stories so far, please take a moment right now to give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps more people find their way here. And if any of these accounts feel familiar, if something about these stories resonates with something you yourself have experienced, please share it in the comments below. This community is built on your voices too, and we love hearing from you. The next account comes from a systems engineer who completed an internship maintaining medical equipment across hospitals in Quito, Ecuador. He has always approached the paranormal with measured skepticism, the kind of person who wants undeniable evidence before they will declare something inexplicable. His work was demanding and practical, troubleshooting ventilators, navigating the chaos of beeping alarms, managing inventory logs in ICUs during some of the most strained and difficult circumstances modern medicine has faced. One particular visit stood out above all others. He was working at the Hospital Militar, a stark, functional facility where early COVID patients occupied the beds in heavy numbers. An isolation chamber had been constructed within the ICU, a sealed plastic enclosure designed specifically for the most contagious cases, connected to the main ward by a narrow passage just wide enough for a single person in full protective equipment to squeeze through. Constant fans maintained the flow of air inward, creating negative pressure to prevent any contaminated air from escaping into the wider ward. The doors to this chamber operated on motion sensors. Not just any motion, a full, open, deliberately placed hand waved in front of the sensor was required to trigger them. An accidental brush of fingers against the panel was not enough. And once a panel slid open, it closed again automatically after precisely 10 seconds, requiring the same deliberate full-hand gesture to reopen from the other side. That particular day, nursing staff were clustered at the far end of the room, every one of their attentions focused intensely on a struggling patient whose monitors were flashing red, a critical situation demanding everything they had. Our narrator was inside the isolation chamber itself, roughly 4 meters away from the entrance, his back turned toward the sensor panel, focused on checking the calibration of a ventilator under the faint buzz of the overhead strip lighting. And the entrance panel hissed open. Smooth, controlled, exactly as it was designed to operate. He spun around. He was standing well beyond the range of the sensors. There was no motion near the panel, no staff member in the narrow connecting passage from the main ward. Those beds were empty, lined up in stillness against the walls. No one had waved a hand anywhere near the sensor, and yet the panel stood open. It remained open for the entire duration of the time he spent finishing his diagnostics, packing his toolkit, and making his way out amid the steady, low whoosh of the negative pressure fans. Nobody entered that room. No one waved a hand. The panel had simply decided on its own to open and then stay open. He filed it away as a likely sensor malfunction. Rushed pandemic installations were common sources of faulty wiring and equipment issues, and that was a reasonable explanation. Later, he mentioned it casually to his nurse friend Maria, who worked that floor regularly. She told him that recent maintenance had checked every gate on that floor. All of them had been verified as functioning perfectly. No faults had been logged. And then she told him what the night shift teams had been reporting, ventilators powering on by themselves in the small hours of the morning, sudden beeps from machines that had not been touched, and perhaps most unsettling of all, the distant sound of children laughing, echoing from places where there were no children. From places where there was no one at all. Every member of the night staff agreed on one thing. These strange events had intensified sharply in the period immediately following the deaths of the first COVID patients. as though something had been stirred awake by the accumulation of loss. A doctor who worked night shifts as the sole physician on site at a small rural district general hospital shares the next two experiences. This facility covered both medical and surgical wards simultaneously, with the emergency department sitting at ground level and the wards descending into cooler basement spaces at the far end of a long corridor built directly into the hillside. A practical architectural solution that created, as it turned out, a passageway that nobody wanted to walk alone at night. One night, after being called urgently to the wards, he found himself hurrying along that corridor, dim, quiet, running beneath the outpatient area overhead. He was halfway through when it hit him. An overwhelming, pressing sensation of being stared at from directly behind, radiating into the back of his neck with an intensity that went far beyond ordinary discomfort. It was the kind of feeling that bypasses the thinking mind entirely and goes straight to the ancient, animal part of the brain that understands danger long before the rest of you catches up. He did not walk the remainder of that corridor. He ran. He sprinted straight to the staircase at the end rather than waiting for the lift, and that crushing sense of being watched did not release him until he emerged into the fresh air of the upper ward. He later learned that the morgue had once been located directly along that corridor, positioned there for years before eventually being relocated to a different part of the building. He never walked that passage alone at night again. The second incident came during a night shift in the emergency department itself. A critically ill man from the clinical decisions unit had been given end-of-life status and had passed away at approximately 11 o'clock that night, leaving his room quiet and still. The staff attended to what needed attending to, and the hours moved toward the deepest part of the night. At around 4 in the morning, the doctor was sitting at the nurse's station when something drew his eyes to the door of that room. Light was growing inside it, slowly, gradually brightening, as though dawn were somehow creeping early through the window blinds and reaching into that closed space. Then the door clicked open of its own accord, and what it revealed was not natural light at all. It was the red glow of emergency lighting, but activated only within that single room. Power across the rest of the unit was completely normal. No outages, no flickering, no backup lights triggered anywhere else along the ward, only there, only in that room where the man had died a few hours earlier. Shortly after, the electronic access doors to the entire department failed, locking everyone inside the unit. One of the nurses, with the particular dark humor that medical staff develop as armor against the things they witness regularly, remembered an old tradition. You must open a window for the spirit to leave. She went and cracked one open wide. 5 minutes later, an alarm sounded from the far isolation room, a room that nobody had entered all evening, because both doors of its negative pressure airlock were suddenly standing open. That room held nothing except the deceased man's stored mobility scooter. No person had gone in. Both doors were open anyway. The unit stayed rattled for quite a while after that. The next story comes from a nurse who works day shifts in a hospital's critical care unit, tending to patients who are approaching the very end of their lives. She has spent 3 years in that environment, and she shares this account with the directness of someone who has no interest in embellishment because the truth is already unsettling enough. She was alone in room 7 with her sedated patient. The only sounds in the space were the muffled chatter drifting from the hallway and the slow, steady rhythm of her patient's breathing, two sounds that together created a kind of fragile quiet that anyone who has worked in a critical care setting will recognize immediately. She was approaching the equipment cart when something on the screen stopped her. One of the touchscreen buttons pressed itself down. No hand touched it. No vibration moved the cart. She watched a sharp tap register on the screen as the button sank inward and the display lit up blue beneath her gaze. She stood absolutely frozen in the empty room, her mind cycling through every possible logical explanation and finding none that held up. And then, before she could fully process what she had just witnessed, the same button pressed itself again. This time silently, gently sinking inward to undo whatever selection it had just made, as though an unseen presence were deliberating over a choice. The chill that ran through her was so fierce and so immediate that she had no choice but to leave the room. Exactly 1 week later, she was walking alone down the main hallway after shift change. Her footsteps were softened slightly by the thin carpet strips lining the baseboard, and the corridor was quiet in the particular way it gets after the handover bustle dies down. Then a whisper came from directly behind her left shoulder. "Hey." She assumed without even thinking about it that a coworker had come up behind her from the unit. She kept walking, expecting to hear more. And then her own name was called clearly, distinctly, from that same spot just behind her shoulder, close enough that she could almost feel breath. She turned around immediately, fully expecting a familiar face. The hallway was empty, just the dim wall lights flickering faintly for a moment before steadying again. Nothing else, no one else. She believes the hospital is haunted. And honestly, given everything else in tonight's collection, it is very difficult to argue otherwise. This next story has a gentler quality to it, a warmth sitting alongside the strangeness, and it involves a pediatrician who had an experience that he normally would never share with a patient's parent. But sometimes, people need to talk about what they've seen, and they find themselves telling the one person sitting in front of them who seems like they might understand. This mother had brought her child in for a routine checkup, vaccines, weights, the standard visit. She noticed immediately that her doctor looked exhausted. Not just tired from a long day exhausted, but the kind of deep soul-level weariness that comes from having witnessed something that the mind cannot stop turning over. She asked him about it in a friendly, easygoing way, and he paused, glanced sideways despite being in his own office, and then asked her almost carefully, "Do you believe there's something after death?" She nodded, and he told her. He had been called out at 3 in the morning for an urgent delivery. A C-section, complications, a situation that was already dire by the time he arrived. The baby did not survive. Too late and too many things wrong at once. It was devastating, as these moments always are. And after helping with the mother and doing everything that needed doing, he finally found himself in the small room off the floor, exhausted beyond description, treating himself to a cup of coffee. And from the operating theater, the same theater where everything had just happened, he heard a baby crying. He rushed out immediately, certain in spite of himself that somehow the baby had come back, that there had been some mistake. But the theater was empty. Everyone had already been taken out. There was no one there, no child, no source for the sound. The theater sat silent and still, and the crying was gone. He stood there in the empty room and wondered, as he has wondered ever since, whether that was a final farewell. Whether that tiny spirit, having arrived into the world and been unable to stay, had offered one last cry before moving on to wherever it was going. No wonder he looked so worn down when that mother sat across from him. Some things settle into a person and do not leave quietly. Our next story carries a completely different energy. It is strange and warm and witnessed by multiple people at once, which makes it particularly compelling. A boy, 11 years old at the time and thoroughly exhausted, was sprawled on one of those thin blue gym mats that hospitals drag out as makeshift beds for families during long waiting periods. His mother was about to give birth to his little brother, and the hour was unreasonably early, and the mat was unpleasantly rubbery against his skin, and the room hummed with that pre-delivery tension that everyone present could feel, but no one was quite talking about. The care team was assembling around the room. A stainless steel cart had been rolled into position. A nurse announced matter-of-factly that they were about to break his mother's water, and everyone moved toward the deep sink mounted on the wall near the door to scrub up. Picture those old hospital faucets, oversized wing-shaped handles in brushed metal, designed for easy elbow activation when hands are busy, labeled hot and cold above a deep porcelain basin. This one had exactly that setup. The boy sat up groggily on his mat. His brother's father was positioned just behind him. And the cold water handle began to turn on its own. A slow, deliberate rotation, accompanied by a faint metallic creak, until a steady stream of water was running freely into the sink. Both the boy and the man behind him sat with their jaws dropped, stunned into complete silence, staring at the faucet that was operating without anyone touching it. Before either of them could fully process what they had just seen, the soap dispenser mounted low on the tiled backsplash, the manual push-lever kind, depressed itself inward, as though an invisible elbow had pressed it, sending a perfectly measured dollop of pink liquid soap splattering messily onto the wet floor below. The water ran strong for another few seconds, swirling the soap into frothy ribbons that disappeared down the drain. And then the handle rotated back, deliberately, carefully, counterclockwise, exactly as anyone would turn a faucet off after finishing. One precise movement, then stillness. Not quite finished, the wall-mounted paper towel dispenser kicked to life on its own, its red sensor light blinking on above the stack of folded white sheets. A single crisp towel dispensed itself, and then something unseen took hold of it midair and pulled it loose, sending it drifting gently toward the floor like a leaf releasing from a branch on a still day. The boy's father finally found his voice. "What the hell did everyone just see?" And the boy answered immediately with a wide-eyed, sincere, utterly unambiguous, "Yep." One of the medical staff barely blinked. "Oh, looks like our resident ghost is pitching in to help deliver your brother." The baby arrived healthy and well. And when the family later pressed the medical team on why they had reacted so calmly to a faucet turning itself on and soap dispensing itself into thin air and a paper towel being pulled loose by nothing at all, the answer they received was a casual shrug and 3 words. "Dude, it's a hospital." Fair enough. This next story is one of the most quietly haunting in tonight's collection, partly because of how it ends. It belongs to a woman whose mother began her career as a laboratory technician at a hospital with a particular resident, one who had earned quite a reputation among the staff for bursting unannounced into the lab and shouting at the technicians to hurry up with their tests, regardless of how backed up the workload was that day. When her mother started there, she was new enough that she did not yet recognize every face from the rotating roster of doctors and specialists who passed through the lab. One afternoon, she was assigned to work alone in the blood bank section at the back, a relatively isolated area, lined with liters of stored blood and the constant whirring sound of centrifuges spinning in the background. A stack of urgent test requests piled on the counter demanding her full concentration. She felt rather than saw that someone was watching her. She looked up. An older, bald man was standing quietly in the doorway of the blood bank. His expression was calm and completely unreadable. One hand was tucked casually inside the pocket of his white lab coat. He said absolutely nothing, just stood there looking at her. Her mother, raised in a loud and direct household with precisely zero tolerance for people wasting her time during a rush, did not look up again. She simply said firmly, without breaking her concentration or her stride, "Not now, I'm busy." Without a word, the man turned and walked back down the hallway. When she finally finished her work and emerged into the main lab area, she mentioned to the other technicians that a doctor had come to check on her in the middle of the rush, and described him exactly: the bald head, the older features, the particular way he held one hand tucked into his coat pocket. They all recognized him immediately, and they told her something that changed the entire shape of the memory. He had died of a heart attack several months before she had ever begun working there. They explained that many of the lab staff had caught glimpses of him over the years, wandering the corridors, lingering near the blood bank, always in that same signature posture, as though he simply didn't know he was gone, as though he had drifted back into his familiar old routine because it was all he knew and some part of him refused to let it go. Her mother still laughs about the story to this day. She is endlessly delighted by the fact that she unknowingly, and with complete confidence, told a ghost to back off and let her handle her work in peace. The next account comes from a nurse who worked night shifts on what the staff called 4 East, the floor where patients too unstable for regular care but not critical enough for the ICU were placed. Long hallways, beeping monitors, rolling IV poles casting jittery shadows under dimmed overhead lights. The kind of ward where the boundary between the world of the living and whatever comes after feels thinner than elsewhere. Room 412 was occupied by a man named Mr. Garrow, retired factory foreman, gravelly voice, calloused hands, and a profound, consuming fear of dying that expressed itself in one particular way. He mashed the call button relentlessly, keeping someone at his bedside as much as possible, seemingly operating on the belief that as long as one of his nurses was physically standing nearby, death would keep its distance. It was both heartbreaking and exhausting, the way fear sometimes is when it has nowhere to go. He died on a Tuesday, 3:42 in the morning, his flatline cutting through the quiet pre-dawn hush of the ward. Our narrator zipped the body bag herself, knotted the toe tag around his foot, and helped load him onto the morgue cart with 2 orderlies. "Goodbye, Mr. Garrow," she whispered as the elevator doors slid shut. Back in room 412, for the post-mortem cleanup, the space was officially vacant. Monitors silenced, sheets stripped, mattress wiped down, the call light cord coiled neatly, remote clipped to the headboard, light switched off, door pulled softly closed. Everything done correctly, everything by the book. 1 hour later, at exactly 4:42, the console at the nursing station chimed. Room 412, normal call. Her charge nurse went pale. "That's impossible, you cleared it yourself." She walked back to that room through a hallway that seemed thicker than it should have. Been the air heavy with something she couldn't name, past empty rooms with their doors ajar and monitors glowing standby green. She pushed into room 412's darkness. The call light remote lay in the exact center of the bare mattress, not on the headboard where she had clipped it, not fallen on the floor beside the bed. In the center of the mattress, its cord torn as though it had been dragged there by something moving low across the surface of the sheets. As she stood there looking at it, the red button pressed itself. Deliberately, clearly, she watched it happen. She and her colleagues tried every possible explanation. There was none that held. 5 minutes after that, the console chimed again from room 412. Staff assistance. This particular alarm requires a physical person inside the room pressing the override button on the wall panel. It is a deliberate emergency call. It cannot malfunction in a way that triggers it on its own. She walked back down that hallway, alone, and pushed open the door to room 412 in the dark. The air inside was wrong, still, stagnant as though nothing had moved in that space for years. She reached for the light switch on the wall, and from the half-open bathroom door on the far side of the room, a rasping, wet wheeze scraped out of the darkness. Then a voice, cracked and low, pushing out of nowhere and everywhere at once. "Nurse, you tied the tag too tight." She ran out screaming, and she never went back. That was the night she handed in her resignation. We have time for a few more, and I want to share each one with you because each carries its own particular weight. A man works nights at a hospital he declines to name, an older facility that once operated across multiple floors but now runs only its ER and psych ward following a buyout, while the upper floors sit long shuttered and sealed. Everyone on the night staff knows about the entity they have collectively named Greg. He is the reason call lights flicker in empty units upstairs, the reason doors lock with sharp, unexplained clicks during supply runs, the reason charts fall from their holders and footsteps follow you down the hallway, getting close, then vanishing when you turn around. Our narrator had his first personal encounter with Greg during a 9:30 p.m. supply run in one of those deserted upper units. Thick, stale air and the faint smell of disuse. A single buzzing bulb, rummaging through carts, footsteps. Approaching down the hallway, then nothing there when he looked up, only the dim red glow of exit signs at each end of the corridor. A call light blaring from directly across the hall, from a room containing nothing but an empty stripped bed frame and a heap of tangled sheets. He crossed over, silenced it, gathered his supplies, turned to leave. It blared again. "Crap, it's really Greg," he muttered, walking back. "Dude, cut that out, it's too late for games." As he reached for the panel, the light triggered again, this time as he was mid-stride, his hand not yet anywhere near the button. He doesn't describe overwhelming terror. What he feels is more like acknowledgement. Greg, in his view, is simply reminding everyone who still occupies those halls that he is here too, that he never entirely left. A man's father was in the ICU at the end of his life, kept going only by the machinery. When the time came, the family accompanied the undertaker down to the hospital morgue in the basement to complete the necessary paperwork. They were led into an office space, and the moment they entered, our narrator was hit by an overpowering smell of cigarette smoke. Thick, immediate, the kind that fills your sinuses and refuses to leave. He was annoyed. He thought it deeply unprofessional for anyone to smoke in an enclosed hospital space. But his mother, a woman with an extraordinarily sensitive nose who had spent decades detecting the smell of cigarettes on her husband the instant he walked through the door, showed no reaction whatsoever. His brother, who has asthma and would have been genuinely suffering in a smoke-filled room, also showed no reaction. They were in that room for over an hour. None of the smell clung to their clothes or hair when they left. On subsequent visits to that same office, there was no trace of smoke anywhere on the premises or on any of the staff. The narrator's conclusion is simple and quietly beautiful. His father was having a final smoke, and for once there was no one to stop him. A woman spent a night or two as a patient in a cardiology ward following a heart ablation procedure. Tethered to monitoring equipment, a catheter still in place, strictly ordered not to move from her bed. Completely immobile, staring at the privacy curtain drawn halfway around her bed frame, the dim hallway visible in the gap beyond. Late in the night, when the ward was at its quietest, she heard something. Coming up the hallway toward her room. A wet, gargling, desperate struggle for breath. The sound of someone drowning in their own lungs, ragged, rattling, each inhale dragging longer than the last. The unmistakable sound of a human body in its final extremity fighting against the inevitable. She lay there unable to move, unable to call out loudly enough to carry past the curtain, straining against the monitoring wires as the sound passed directly outside her room and continued slowly on down the corridor toward the nurse's station. It went on for at least half an hour. Then silence. When her nurse finally came in to check vitals, she begged her to go check on whoever was down the hall. The nurse paused, blood pressure cuff halfway around her arm, and said calmly that she was currently the only patient admitted to the entire heart ward that night. The secure double doors required a staff badge to open. No one else could have gotten through. What she heard remains entirely unexplained. In a maternity ward in northern peninsular Malaysia, a family had gathered around a cousin's bed to celebrate her newborn. 6-bed room, 5 occupied, warm with the overlapping voices of families sharing in the joy of new life. The only empty bed was the one nearest the far window. A girl of about 7 years old, sitting on a stool near that empty bed, suddenly jabbed a small finger at the space above the vacant mattress and said sharply, "Leave my auntie alone." The room went quiet. Her mother knelt beside her and asked gently who she was talking to. The girl pointed at the empty air. Her mother asked what this presence was doing. The girl answered, "He's pulling faces at her." Her mother nodded, calm, completely unsurprised, and guided her daughter out toward the vending machines, leaving the rest of the room in stunned, murmuring silence. Later inquiries confirmed that that wing of the hospital was one of the oldest sections of the building, its concrete walls marked by decades of expansion and renovation, and it had a long-standing reputation for hauntings. The mother's absolute calm in the moment suggested this was not the first time her daughter had seen something that others could not. Children, it seems, see what we have learned to stop seeing. A story from a middle school student who, in 2012, had an experience in the basement of her elementary school that has never been explained to her satisfaction. The school at that time was built around an older structure that had once served as a hospital in the early 1900s. The old hospital basement had been partially repurposed as storage and partially as a special education room. On this particular day, she and 2 classmates with permission to work there went down to the basement ostensibly to complete a group project, and, she admits honestly, mostly to goof around and avoid doing actual work for the last period of the day. They had been there about 30 minutes, starting to pack up to head back to class, when a man came down the stairs. She had never seen him before. He was wearing a dark blue jumpsuit, the kind that suggests maintenance work or custodial duties. White man, around 6 feet tall, dark gray hair, probably in his 50s, his face weathered and his clothes carrying the marks of hard work. They assumed he was the building custodian and said hello. The conversation that followed was strange from the start. He asked them if they believed in ghosts. Being a child with a strong interest in the paranormal, she engaged with this. He talked about aura colors and what they meant and his wife's ability to travel the world through astral projection. He spoke for 10 to 15 minutes until the bell rang and they had to get back to class. Something had felt off to her the entire time, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. When they told their teacher what had happened, she was immediately concerned and directed them to the school secretary to ask if any substitute custodians had been working that day. The secretary's reaction was unmistakable. She had absolutely no idea who they were describing. She would look into it. But the expression on her face made very clear that no one matching that description had any reason to be in that building. No explanation was ever found. A nurse working in a small preoperative surgical ward in an older wing of a medical center shares the final account in tonight's collection. 10 beds, 2 with actual doors, the rest separated by curtains, and a central monitoring station where all bedside readings feed into a single screen. A system designed for oversight and efficiency, but one that shows readings where there should be none, blood pressure spikes from beds that sat empty all day, oxygen readings blinking on from bays with no patient in them, IV poles rolling slowly across open rooms under their own power. Patients have asked to be discharged early after watching it happen. Directly across from the nursing station is the room reserved for confused patients, those with dementia, those at highest risk of falling, the ones who need the most constant watching. 2 years ago, a fire broke out in that room. It scorched one corner of the wall in a pattern that looks, to those who work there, like fingers dragging upward through the paint. Maintenance painted over it. The shape bleeds through anyway if you look long enough. Patients beg to be moved out of that room. They insist someone is standing behind the curtain, even when it hangs wide open with nothing behind it. Others describe faces pressed against the ceiling tiles, watching them while they sleep. One elderly man kept pointing at the corner, whispering about a tall thing that was waiting for the lights to go out. A wooden crucifix that had been mounted above the sink one morning was found shattered, the body of the figure gone entirely, only located afterward when someone noticed it had been driven headfirst directly into the ceiling panel, not resting against it, driven into it with a force no human being in that room could have applied. No alarm had gone off. No one had entered. The security cameras had caught only static. Clergy have come through multiple times to bless that ward. In that particular room, they always stay longer than planned. One of them would not step more than a few feet inside, saying that it felt cursed in a way that went beyond ordinary unpleasantness, that it felt like something was inside it that had no intention of leaving. No amount of cleaning or brightening or repainting changes the weight of that space. It simply remembers, and whatever it is remembering refuses to release its hold. Well, friends, that brings us to the end of tonight's collection, and what a journey it has been. From a rocking chair in an abandoned nursery ward to a burning room that leaves its mark through every coat of paint. From a ghost still making his rounds in a laboratory to a faucet that turned itself on to help welcome a new life into the world. Hospitals, it seems, carry more within their walls than any of us are truly prepared to reckon with. What do you think? Is there a rational explanation waiting to be found for all of these? Or is there something to the idea that places which absorb so much human emotion, so much grief and relief, fear, and hope, endings and beginnings, might hold onto fragments of all of it long after the people themselves are gone? I would genuinely love to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your own experiences if you have them, and tell me which of tonight's stories stayed with you the most. If you enjoyed spending this evening with us, please don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who appreciates a good haunted story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Click the bell as well so you are notified the moment our next collection arrives, because you will absolutely not want to miss it. A very special and heartfelt thank you goes out to our members and patrons, whose names you can see on your screen right now. Your support means more than I can say, and it keeps this channel going and growing. If you would like to join them, you are more than welcome to follow the link over to Patreon. And even just stopping by to enjoy the free content I post there every week is truly appreciated. That is it from me for tonight. Stay warm, stay curious, and as always, stay awesome. I will see you tomorrow as we close out Ghost Week with one final, chilling collection of paranormal stories. Until then, dear friends, good night.